Hey guys, Ex-Peon here. Today, we're investigating the hidden fourth core class of original Dungeons & Dragons, the Anti-Cleric. If you haven't heard of this class, that's for good reason. It isn't explicitly a player character class in OD&D, and I don't believe it appears in any later edition of D&D, at least not as a core class. It is mentioned here and there within OD&D though, and there is enough to potentially piece together a functioning fourth class. First, what does the text actually say about anti-clerics? In the section describing the cleric class, it mentions that clerics of 7th level or higher are either law or chaos, and there is a sharp distinction between them. In the section detailing the alignments of various creatures, we see that patriarchs are aligned with law and evil high priests are aligned with chaos. Patriarch is the capstone level title for clerics, and we actually see in the back of the Proto Player's Handbook that evil high priest is a capstone level title for anti-clerics. Based off of this, clerics are lawful or neutral in alignment until 7th level, at which point they can only be lawful. Anti-clerics are at least chaotic in alignment, though nothing indicates that they can't be neutral until 7th level. I'll make a quick interjection to answer the possible criticism that I'm conflating law with good or chaos with evil. I'll just note that I'm not conflating those things, the authors are, at least according to my interpretation of the text. I'm not so sure the clear delineation between good, evil, law, and chaos were nearly as concrete then as they are now. It really does appear that to the authors, law was basically good and chaos was basically evil. Hence why evil high priests were in chaos and patriarchs were in law. But anyway, interjection over. So, clerics and anti-clerics differ by alignment. How do you become an anti-cleric, though? The text states, quote, there are anti-clerics who have similar powers to clerics, close quote, and it gives them a full suite of level titles, most of which are just the old level title with the word evil slapped on. That wording makes it unclear, though, if they're intended to be a player character class or if they're just classed NPCs one can encounter in the world. Whether or not a player can start out as an anti-cleric, there is evidence that they can become one. In the section on the cleric class, it lists out benefits 8th level clerics, patriarchs receive, namely a castle and free soldiers. It states that a patriarch who, quote, changes sides loses the benefits of their castle and free soldiers. Presumably, this is referring to a lawful patriarch who changes alignment and becomes a chaotic, evil high priest. In the description of spells, it notes that the Finger of Death, the reversed version of the spell Raise Dead, can be used by a cleric type, quote, in a life or death situation, but misuse will immediately turn him into an anti-cleric. There's three conclusions that can be drawn from this. The first conclusion is that anti-clerics are not intended to be a player character class, and that any cleric who misuses Finger of Death or otherwise betrays their alignment becomes chaotic, and also becomes a non-player character controlled by the DM. The second conclusion is that anti-clerics are not meant to be a player character class until 7th level, at which point a cleric who misuses Finger of Death or otherwise chooses to betray their alignment becomes chaotic and becomes an anti-cleric. The third option is that anti-clerics are intended to be a player option from level 1, and you can just choose to start as one. In fact, you can potentially even be neutral in alignment until 7th level, at which point you must become chaotic if you are to remain an anti-cleric. While I personally think the third option is the most fun of the three possibilities, I am not entirely confident it is what's intended by the authors. Let's see how anti-clerics actually work. First, there is no indication that anti-clerics differ in any way from normal clerics in regards to weapon access, armor access, XP progression, etc. The only difference seems to be in alignment, level titles, turn undead access, and spellcasting. I already mentioned the differences in capstone level titles, but let's just look at the whole list because it's fun. Going from 1st level to 8th, we have acolytes or evil clerics, adepts or evil adepts, village priests or shamans, vicars or evil priests, curates or evil curates, bishops or evil bishops, lamas or evil lamas, and patriarchs or evil high priests. Do you think perhaps anti-clerics are evil? It's not entirely clear. Turning to turn undead, the text notes in the Clerics vs. Undead Monsters section that evil clerics cannot turn undead. I've heard AD&D gave the option for evil clerics to control undead rather than turn them, but OD&D simply strips that class element away from anti-clerics. Finally, we get the huge difference between clerics and anti-clerics. Spells. More specifically, reversed spells. There are two sentences describing reversed spells. The first states that, quote, underlined clerical spells are reversed by evil clerics. The second sentence states in reference to anti-clerics that, quote, those clerical spells underlined on the table for cleric spells have reverse effect. The question that arises from these statements is whether anti-clerics can choose to reverse applicable spells or if they have to reverse applicable spells. The way I read it, those spells simply are reversed by anti-clerics, but one could easily read it as anti-clerics having the option to reverse those spells. The difference between those two perspectives is huge. Before we look at those specific spells, let's just look at the clerical spells that aren't underlined so we can see what spells anti-clerics definitely have access to in normal fashion. These spells are Detect Magic, Find Traps, Hold Person, Speak with Animals, Remove Curse, Locate Object, Neutralize Poison, Turn Sticks to Snakes, Speak with Plants, Create Water, Commune, Quest, Insect Plague, and Create Food. As you can see, regardless of how their other spells work, anti-clerics still have access to a solid suite of spells that are applicable in combat, dungeon exploration, and even wilderness exploration. The list of spells that are reversed by anti-clerics is as follows: Cure Light Wounds, Purified Food and Water, Detect Evil, Protection from Evil, Light, Bless, Cure Disease, Continual Light, Cure Serious Wounds, Greater Protection from Evil, Dispel Evil, and Raise Dead. It isn't entirely clear how each spell works in reverse, as only one spell actually has its reverse form explicitly spelled out, so I'll be proceeding with a decent amount of subjective interpretation. Starting with Cure Light Wounds, I think it is pretty safely assumed to become Cause Light Wounds. Cure Light Wounds actually requires a cleric to take an entire turn, or 10 minutes, and restores d6 plus 1 hit points. So Cause Light Wounds, if reversed, literally becomes an unusable spell for dealing damage, unless the victim believes they are receiving a Cure Light Wounds spell. Even then, it's barely better than just hitting someone with a mace. Purify Food and Water likely becomes Poison or Putrefy Food and Water. Whether that would induce a save versus poison at the risk of outright death, or just spoil the food and water and make it inedible and non-potable, is up to the DM. Detect Evil would likely become Detect Good, allowing you to detect goodness in any creature or object. A viable alternative would be for it to become Obscure Evil, which seems a bit more useful for a ne'er-do-well at any rate. Protection from Evil probably just becomes Protection from Good. Light becomes Darkness. It's worth noting that OD&D doesn't explicitly grant elves or dwarves any kind of dark vision, though one could interpret chainmail as giving them dark vision. Also, monsters who aren't controlled by the players can see in the dark, so while darkness no doubt has its uses, it is probably benefiting enemy monsters more than your allies. That's just worth noting. Bless is similar to Cure Light Wounds in that it takes a full turn to bestow its benefit to an ally, which is +1 on attack rolls and +1 morale. The reverse of Bless, Bane, would likely give a victim -1 on attack rolls and -1 morale. That's not that bad of an effect, but when are you going to have an entire turn to inflict a Bane upon a willing victim? Cure Disease probably becomes Cause Disease, though it's entirely up to the DM to determine how diseasing someone might work. Continual Light likely becomes Continual Darkness. Cure Serious Wounds works the same as Cure Light Wounds, except for the fact that it heals 2d6 plus 2 hit points instead of d6 plus 1 hit points. Thus, its reverse form would also remove 2d6 plus 2 hit points. Same story for Protection from Greater Evil. Dispel Evil would likely be reversed into Dispel Good, letting you dispel a good sending or spell. Finally, we get to the capstone, the reversed form of Raise Dead, the Finger of Death. It's the only reverse spell laid out in detail, and it allows an anti-cleric to shoot a death ray at an opponent, killing them if they fail their saving throw. Obviously, this is the coolest of all clerical spells, and it's enough reason for a cleric player to go bad. Having gone through all the spell's reversed forms, it's time to finally appraise this class. As I said earlier, it's not entirely clear how this class is intended to work, whether it's meant to be a typically hostile NPC class that PC clerics can turn into through misbehavior, or if it's meant to be a viable alternative to the clerical class they start as at level 1. Looking through all the reverse cleric spells, we come to a serious problem with most of them. They seem generally more useful for a hostile NPC class than for a player character class. The reversed forms of Cause Light Wounds and Bless basically require a given anti-cleric to pretend to be a good cleric and pretend to be casting a beneficial spell. Darkness only really hinders a player character party, but doesn't affect monsters. Poisoning, or just spoiling food and water, could be situationally useful, but it also seems like a great way for an anti-cleric in disguise to get an entire party sick or worse. Detecting good, dispelling good, or protecting yourself from good also can't be useful in the vast majority of circumstances, as unless you're in a special campaign where you're fighting against the good guys, most of your enemies will be evil or at least neutral. Giving someone a disease also seems kind of random and pointless, unless it's a hostile NPC trying to screw over a player by giving that player a disease. The capstone spell, the Finger of Death, is awesome though, and it's applicable basically whenever you're in combat. So unlike all the other spells, that spell definitely probably makes it worth it. Looking over all these reverse spells, we're left with a catalog of spells that mostly don't seem too useful for an adventure, but do seem like a great grab bag for a tricky anti-cleric in disguise. These spells, in conjunction with anti-clerics not being able to turn undead, make me think that this class was not intended to be a viable 4th player character class, at least until 7th level. I do think there is an alternate use for this class, one I've been alluding to. I'm about to spoil B2 Keep on the Borderlands. If you think you might play or run this module and don't want it spoiled, skip to the next timestamp to skip this section. If you're one of my players, thank you for watching, but please skip past this section. Having given that warning, let's proceed. In Gary Gygax's intro adventure for basic Dungeons & Dragons, B2 Keep on the Borderlands, there is an NPC priest who is the archetypical anti-cleric. He's a traveling priest currently staying in the keep who is jovial and learned. He's a great listener and a great companion and host. He's quite outspoken about his hatred of evil and will happily accompany any player characters to the Caves of Chaos. He also has 2 followers who are avoided by the people in the keep because they don't speak, apparently due to a vow of silence until they earn priestly standing. In short, this priest seems like the perfect cleric, except for an odd detail about him and his followers. When the players actually take this guy to the Caves of Chaos, he seems like an excellent addition, being 3rd level with an armor class of -1, 18 hit points, a +1 mace, and scrolls of hold person and silence in addition to his usual spell assortment. The facade of being a great enemy of evil and perhaps even a mentor to 1st level characters is stripped away in a critical moment in battle where he will turn his magic upon his supposed allies and attack them in some way. The book suggests using a reversed Cure Light Wounds to damage a player character or blinding them with light, but the best option would probably be to bash them. To me, this priest is the ultimate anti-cleric and probably what anti-clerics were intended to be, at least until they reached 7th level and could fling around Fingers of Death. The OD&D anti-cleric has all these ways to subtly screw with players. They can pretend to heal an injured player, but actually finish them off with cause light wounds. They can claim to bless an ally, but actually give them bane. There's no guarantee anyone would even know. They can corrupt their food and water, making them sick or worse. In a critical encounter, they can reverse light into darkness, blinding the party while leaving the monsters with full vision. So, what is the conclusion to draw? Is the anti-cleric the secret 4th core class of OD&D? My ultimate conclusion is maybe, but probably not. Without Turn Undead, they're basically just outright worse clerics until level 7, at which point they become extremely powerful. So maybe it's the class for the conniving long con type of player who's willing to wait for real power. Maybe it's an NPC class player character clerics can turn into if they break their vows, similar to how paladins could lose their paladin status by breaking their alignment. And maybe it's just meant to be an antagonistic NPC class that at low levels pretends to be your ally, only to stab you in the back, and at high levels flings death rays at you. Currently, I see that last option as being the most probable, though that could coexist with anti-clerics being an optional class high-level clerics can switch into, trading their 8th level castle and followers for the Finger of Death. That, to me, seems like a fair trade, unlike trading Turn Undead and useful spells like Light and Healing for niche reverse spells like Cause Wounds. So that's my interpretation of how I think anti-clerics were intended to work in OD&D. I ultimately think they're meant to be hostile NPCs who often disguise themselves as regular clerics to stab players in the back until a cleric gets to 7th level or higher, at which point they become a viable prestige class of sorts, where you trade Turn Undead, your many useful spells, your castle, and your followers for more niche reverse spells and the incredible Finger of Death. I've been talking about what's written in the rules because I think we're all curious about what's embedded in the original version of the game. Obviously, though, we can just house rule things, and the book even encourages this. It outright says a player could play a dragon, starting at 1st level. So you can definitely choose to make anti-clerics whatever you'd like. If I were to make my own spin on anti-clerics in OD&D, this is roughly what I'd do. I'd make 3 clerics, 1 for each alignment, those 3 alignments being law, neutrality, and chaos, recognizing that in this version of the game, good and law are basically the same, and chaos and evil are basically the same. Lawful clerics would just be the default cleric, while chaotic clerics would basically be the anti-clerics I've described. They would only cast relevant cleric spells in reverse, but they would trade turn undead for control undead or something equivalent. I think that would be a roughly equal trade in terms of power. Neutral clerics would be different in that they have no effect on undead whatsoever, but they have the choice to reverse relevant clerical spells or cast them normally. Also, they would be capped at 6th level, so they would never have access to the sheer power of raising the dead or casting death rays. Thus, lawful clerics are defensive and supportive, while hard countering the undead, while chaotic clerics are tricky, sneaky, and eventually supremely powerful, while being able to have undead minions. Neutral clerics don't end up as powerful, but they are the most flexible casters. At least that's kind of my rough concept for a way to make this idea a bit more playable. Well, how about yourself, dear viewer? Do you agree with my assessment of anti-clerics within OD&D? Do you see them as a viable player character class, or do you see them as an excellent undercover agent for the forces of chaos? Do you have your own house-ruled spin on them? Let me know. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and have a good one. Goodbye.